Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I greet all of you from the lovely city of Amsterdam, where I've been over the last week or so. Welcome to Humanity Rising. I want to welcome you in the spirit of new communications and media today. That's the subject that we'll be exploring for the next 90 minutes or so. And to tee up the profound implications of when we talk about new communication and media, I'd like to go back to 1965, to Gordon Moore, who at the time was working at Fairchild Semiconductor, one of the big companies in Silicon Valley in California. He went on to found Intel Corporation, which is one of the biggest silicon chip companies in the world still today. And he came up with what he called the Moore's Law. He noticed that the number of transistors in a silicon chip were doubling about every year. And then as things progressed, he saw that they were doubling about every 2 years. And then they settled at around 18 months. And that notion of the doubling of transistors and the doubling of capacity, computer capacity, was what really governed the emergence of the high-tech industry. And the question that began to arise in the 1980s and 1990s is, when would this doubling go exponential? And to understand what exponential means, just imagine for a moment a chessboard. There's 64 squares in a chessboard. If you start in the lower left square with 1 grain of rice, and you double the number of grains for all the squares going up to the upper right-hand corner, when you get to 64 squares, the number of grains of rice literally goes exponential. And the question that I want to just contemplate for a moment is, when did the world go exponential in terms of knowledge and therefore communication and media? According to Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist who's written many, many books that no doubt many of you have read, says, and many analysts agree with him, that the world went exponential in 2007. We went off the chessboard. They say that now human knowledge is doubling about every 12 and a half minutes. Just take that in for a second. And by the time this program will have ended, human knowledge would have doubled maybe 5 times. That's how explosive, exponential growth is. There are 2 things that happened in 2007 that are just worthy of note. One is that Steve Jobs and Apple Computer came out with the iPhone. I have one right here. Most of you have smartphones one way or the other. The other thing that happened in 2007 was the founding of Facebook, which, warts and all, and there are many of them, Facebook now serves nearly a quarter, sometimes a third of the human population, well over 2 billion people interact every day through Facebook. The amount of information that every single one of us has with a smartphone, with a computer, over the internet is almost infinite. The way that we can interact with people anywhere, under all kinds of circumstances, is almost infinite. And we've seen the power of a single YouTube. Think of George Floyd in May of 2020. A teenage girl was watching him die, and she took on her iPhone the video that ignited a global movement. We're watching it in the Ukraine right now. They've got satellite photos of every Russian tank and the troop movements, and they can now photograph things through Google Earth, almost everything that moves everywhere. That's what exponential knowledge means. And so the question that we want to contemplate today is, in the midst of all that possibility and the implications in communication and media, when so much is possible, from an individual to a community to a corporation, how do we understand what's happening, and how does the progressive movement utilize the instrumentalities of communication and media, which have been both globalized and radically decentralized and individualized, in a way that serves the greater good? Humanity Rising is an example of a new form of communication and media. In the midst of the pandemic, when everybody was sitting there with their head between their knees, wondering what was going on, we were all in lockdown, we had this idea: why don't we create a daily opportunity for people anywhere in the world to come together and talk about their experiences? We all now go through the pandemic, because one of the consequences of the pandemic is it put everybody in the world in the same conversation for the first time. That's exponential. And as you all know, the rest, as they say, is history, as hundreds of organizations and tens of thousands of people from all over the world joined in. We had no idea that that was going to happen. But it's an example of what is possible with new forms of communication. In a new form of communication and media. So that's what we're going to contemplate today. But before we dive in, I want to bring us just to a quick pause in all the hustle and bustle in the midst of an exponentially explosive world. The most important thing that we can do every day is just keep our center, and in the midst of chaos, maintain coherence. And we do that as we start the Humanity Rising sessions, as many of you know, by just taking a moment or so to just breathe and close your eyes. And for the next minute, just attune yourself to your heart and find the center in the storm, just for a minute. Thank you, everyone. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce someone who's become a friend over the last couple of months. One of the examples of exponential. I didn't know Indra Adnan before Humanity Rising, but we became acquainted through an introduction from Marilyn Hamilton, actually. And Indra is one of the co-founders of Alternative UK, which has really been working in the domain of citizen empowerment. How do you create and nurture and expand and scale citizen action networks that can bring people into politics in a fresh and innovative and progressive way? And recently, she's been exploring new communication and media possibilities. So we agreed that one of the first things we wanted to do is to bring her and her colleagues onto Humanity Rising, literally to tell us what they're up to and what they're visioning, because it may be that if we can master communication and media in the appropriate way in this time, when the world is confronted by so many simultaneously conflicting global crises, we can make the kind of difference that all of us so desperately want to make. So Indra, I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising and your colleagues. Indra is going to make a 10 or 15 minute presentation, then I'll circle back for a little bit of a conversation, and then she'll bring the rest of her colleagues in, and we'll just dialogue about this domain. But Indra, welcome to Humanity Rising.
No, thank you so much, Jim. And thanks very much for your introduction, because it was very much the kind of context within which we started the Alternative UK. Now the Alternative Global, by the way, since March the 1st. Thinking about the exponential, just like you were describing, I'm really thinking about this last 3 decades as a revolution that we've been in. I mean, it's very common for people to call for a revolution. The more that we face these, shared multiple crises, of the environment and of division and of social injustice, and but the truth is we've been in a revolution for 3 decades now, I would say, since the birth of the internet. Moving from a situation where, the vast majority of people were only ever, try and remember this, receiving our information from a particular source or from on high through government or through our employers or, through newspapers, but in a very specific way. And we had no way to generate information ourselves or to be proactive in really mobilizing each other. And I mean, exponential is not only the fact of it, but it's also the experience of it. We've moved from being passive. I mean, I'm now talking about everyone with access to a smartphone. We've moved from being passive, to being the makers, of news. And, what I'll describe a little bit more. But what Joseph Nye describes as, we're now in the era of the non-state actor. So every one of us has been developing our agency in small ways, but also in potentially huge ways. So very, very much the page that I wanted to start on. Thank you. And just to say at the beginning that sadly, we won't be joined with one of our participants as billed, Komotso Matsunyane, because unfortunately she's in Johannesburg and she is experiencing at the moment regular loss of electricity. So she's just at the beginning of a sort of 4-hour blackout, and unfortunately it's coincided with this moment. But what we will be doing, I'm just going to break out into a presentation in a moment, and we'll give you a broad view of why we're at this moment now where within our 5-year inquiry into the question, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? Why we're now really focusing on this necessity of an alternative media system. So I'll be talking for about 10 to 15 minutes. Then I'll come back and we can have a bit of a discussion with Jim, but also feel free at that point for anybody to put a question into the chat box, and we'll be able to maybe pick up one or two questions then. Then I'll be moving on to my co-initiator, Pat Kane, who's also the editor of the Daily Alternative and has been for the past 5 years. He's going to share with us the beginnings of this process, which will take some time, of building a new media platform. And then we'll come back and have a discussion about that. And then finally, I'll invite Sushma Joseph from India to share with us some of her perspectives on how a new media could really make a difference. So let's start with this. So I'm very conscious that as we're speaking, as we are talking at this minute, we are currently in a very, it's a very difficult media space. We're in a difficult media space, almost one that contradicts everything that Jim and I were just describing. We've been talking about the last 30 years of this growing sensibility, this growing agency, this moving away from a 20th century that we would call, and many have begun to describe as the century of war. But just recently, literally in this past couple of weeks, we've been, in a sense, suddenly pulled back into this sensibility, and our headlines are once again full of the atrocity in Ukraine, what is happening as we are experiencing, very live, more live probably than was ever possible in the past, but the experience of a military invasion, one country of another. I don't know how it feels to you, all of us in this audience here, but it's quite a visceral experience of being pulled back into a different sensibility, one that really defies our sense of what is possible. However, we also know that even as this war is now taking on and grabbing all the headlines and really invading our mental space, that all the time, just behind that, there's another crisis that now moves off the front pages of our newspapers, and in fact, hasn't really occupied the front pages of our newspapers in a way that is at all commensurate with the urgency, which is the climate crisis that really has put us in within 10 years of moving beyond the possibility of turning the corner from extinction, what COP26 describes as code red, and something that here on Humanity Rising, we have been given enough space and attention to. But again, our media headlines, the newspapers that we can get easy access to, the ones that most people are reading, really don't bring this urgency to our attention. The one thing that maybe has been brought to our attention, which is one of the results of the climate crisis, or one of the effects, if you like, of the causes of the 20th century and before, has been this COVID crisis. And over this COVID period, we have been able to experience, to some extent, in a way that wasn't really anticipated and probably not planned at all by the media barons that in a sense, define what it is that we're thinking about, is the COVID crisis, where for the first time, we've been able to connect with people all over the world in a very practical way, to share an experience globally that in the sense has unified, or brought us at least into some sort of common experience, not just the common experience of people wearing masks or people moving into lockdown, but also the common question of the difference of the kind of experience that is being offered to people who have very difficult circumstances now find themselves trapped in very oppressive environments, and those who have been using the COVID couple of years actually to think more deeply, to contemplate more deeply, to move into a new relationship with nature. This inequality of the experience of COVID has actually been shared across a lot of our media networks, and particularly in the new ways of communicating with each other, such as Zoom and WhatsApp, that really proliferated over this period. So how then does this relate directly to the way that we began the alternative, which was nearly exactly 5 years ago today? And the reason that we started this political platform was because we were experiencing very extremely in the UK the effects of a political culture and structure that divided our societies. I mean, not simply divided them along class barriers, not simply divided them along age or cultural barriers, but a political structure that consistently divides people along questions, along issues. In this case, you'll all be familiar with the Brexit issue that not only divided the nation, if you like, amongst leavers and remainers, but went much deeper to really divide even families. So determined, in a way, was this issue to cause chaos amongst the people in the UK. And this was the direct result of this deep division that was happening in our society. The day that Joe Cox was murdered was the day that we decided to form the political platform, the Alternative UK, to ask the question, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? So at that very moment, we were really challenging the media for being so divisive, for causing so much polarization, along a question that only months before mattered very little to the British population. I mean, of course, it was a political issue, but it wasn't something that was dividing communities or dividing a nation so extremely, let alone dividing families. So the function of the political parties and the way the media carries that message was the thing that we are questioning and have been questioning for the last 5 years. But just to give you a little backdrop on that, it wasn't simply a reaction to Brexit that caused this question of what is the role of the news media in creating the reality that we are constantly living. Well before that, maybe 25 years ago or so, I myself was studying the phenomenon of conflict resolution and conflict transformation. And some of you will be familiar with this distinction that I want to bring up here today between conflict resolution and conflict transformation, because that the understanding and the learning that I experienced at that time was very much part of what's led to the coming proposal for a very different kind of media. So if we're talking about conflict resolution, we think about the many conflicts that we have in our society and we think about how they can be solved. But very often we think about two parties that are facing each other down, if you like, and that the resolution would be about these two parties coming to some agreement or some negotiation about a settlement. Now, I'm sure there are people amongst us who would know that conflict resolution is very much more complex than that. But essentially, that is how it's presented to us, that two people or two parties are disagreeing. There has to be some negotiation. People have to make some form of compromise, and eventually some sort of settlement is reached. Conflict transformation, on the other hand, which is something that I learned from Johan Galtung, who's known as the father of peace studies, is a very much more complex affair. It talks about multiple parties to any conflict. It talks about the cultural and the structural violence that's implicit in the context of those two, or of those multi-parties moving into conflict. And then it questions the language within which solutions are pursued. And at no point do two parties come around a table. This is always about 12 or maybe 15 parties moving into a circle wherein every one of them has been heard carefully, and that really any sort of possibility of the way forward is seen as transformation, meaning it brings into this circle something that doesn't yet exist, that every party to this conflict can buy into. So it's really much more than a zero-sum game where you either lose a bit or you gain a bit. This is more about bringing in new realities that can offer every one of the parties a new future to be part of. And in many senses, the conflict that existed before drops away. So this idea of conflict transformation is very key to a new kind of journalism. Because if you see here, another one of Galtung's teaching was around the difference between war journalism and peace journalism. Now, most people, when they hear the term peace journalism, will immediately think, yeah, that's very nice. You know, that would be good for everyone. Of course, everyone wants peace, but they can't necessarily see that the possibility of peace is woven into this much deeper structures, cultural and structural possibilities, and that war journalism arises out of this more dualistic solution, zero-sum game way of talking about conflict. So if you're able to, I won't go through all of these points on the right here, but if you go through them now, you'll see that the kind of journalism that we have generally is what Galtung would describe as war journalism. And what that means is, even though our news media outlets believe that they are simply reporting the facts, they are always reporting the facts within a bigger structure that imagines resolution but cannot imagine transformation. So do have a look at that list. Just briefly, it's always talking about the violence. It quickly moves from conflict to the possibility of violence, doesn't talk much about the peace opportunities. It talks about the other, always identifies who the enemy is, always interrogates the enemy's perspective, but tends to not interrogate its own. And is very much skewed, as it says there, towards victory and a resolution of the conflict. So that once the war is over, we, the readers, can collectively sigh relief, and it pushes us towards this idea of never again can this conflict happen, and tends to ignore that the structure and the culture that was there before giving rise to this conflict is pretty much still present and will continue to give rise to conflict until we begin to address these situations at the structural and cultural level. So this kind of, the term peace journalism only arises in the light of something that has to be understood as war journalism. Of course, within an idea of a new media system, we're trying to be transcendent. We're trying to move beyond that and create a different way of reporting the facts that are described there in the left-hand column. Excuse me, flipping between these slides. That's my computer is very live, not unlike the slides themselves. So the other aspect that I wanted to bring into this, how did we come to start the alternative, is this shift also over these, more than over these last 30 years, from an understanding of power as simply power and moving into a distinction between hard power and soft power. So hard power, just generally is guns and money. It's the power of coercion. It's how you can force an outcome. That is hard power. And soft power is what is described by Joseph Nye, who coined this term originally in the 1990s, is the power of attraction. Now that means, how do you draw attention? How do you make relationship? And through relationship, how do you have influence? So, typically a country has soft power, and you might imagine that, for example, Hollywood and Disneyland are the carriers, if you like, of the American dream. So people watch American films, they visit them, they watch the cartoons or Netflix, and through that medium, through that form of attraction, the American dream is being carried out all over the world, and that causes people to want to be part of the American dream, but also to go there, be part of the industry, buy its products, and so on. So what Joseph Nye was saying at a very important moment post the Vietnam War was that America had hard power, but it was even richer in soft power, and it's the soft power that would continue to dominate the world. Now, this has actually changed, one would imagine, in the last 10 years, and maybe even more acutely in the last 5 years. American soft power is on the wane. But more importantly, as we mentioned at the beginning, other people are much more capable now, because of the power of the internet, to be trading in this kind of influence through their ability to create spectacle, through their ability to tell new stories about who we are and about what it is that we want and need. So here are two examples of ways of using soft power rather than hard power. On the left, you'll be familiar, that's Extinction Rebellion, really using the power of spectacle, an irresistible image there to tell a story about climate change and about grief and about the possibility of extinction. And on the right, a much more crude example, more like an advertising horde, which simply told a lie about what Brexit would offer to the UK should you vote to leave. We're all familiar with those two kinds of soft power. But the one thing that in all of this, and I think this is important to just bring into this conversation, the thing that we cannot ignore in all of this moment, in this decade, these 3 decades of revolution that we've been in, we cannot ignore the emotional needs of individuals, because when we ignore that, somebody else is paying attention to that and harnessing and triggering emotion. And we're going to be hearing from Sushma later on about the pros and cons of that and how we can maybe leverage that in new ways. But there has to be an understanding that every human being has emotional needs that they are constantly trying to get met. And whether they get met in poor ways through, for example, through consuming, creating status for people through buying a pair of Nike trainers, or whether we can get them met in better ways through, for example, becoming part of a community agency network and getting your needs for belonging and meaning and purpose met in that way, we cannot ignore the driving force and the motivations that arise from our emotional needs. It's if we ignore those and we only concentrate on the we spaces, meaning the places where we can come together, and don't really pay attention to the I spaces in which people can be easily distracted away from a cause or easily distracted away from a purpose, then we can easily be sabotaged. And in fact, has been shown time and time again that we are being sabotaged, by those who know how to get at us emotionally. So how do we possibly keep focused on our goals in what is now described as the VUCA world, a world of volatility, of uncertainty, of complexity, of ambiguity? Well, the conclusion we came to at The Alternative is that we have to be really focused on really bringing into oneness again the idea of the health, the whole health of the human being, in connection with the whole health of the planet. So really, our health and the planetary health, we have to keep telling the story of how these two things cannot be disconnected. And the best place, in a way, the best vehicle for that are these community agency networks where people can come together, find themselves in it, and find that there is a way to act upon the planet. More about that later. So on our 5th birthday, as I said, after doing 5 years of reporting in as different a way as we can on all the innovation that's been occurring outside of the bubble of the current party political structures that most of us are subject to, we came to the conclusion that we really need to invite people to stand on a new ground together, and we're calling this new ground Planet A. It's a media spectacle, if you like. It's an offer to your imagination that all of these things that are, that we know are out there somewhere on the internet, that they are actually coming together and can be experienced together by putting our feet on this ground that we're calling Planet A. I'm not going to go into each one of these things individually now because I'll be taking too much time, but do visit our website and you'll see how after 5 years, we've become aware that there is a new social politics arising. There are new and next economies taking shape. There are new forms of community agency networks that give anybody really a way to have access to these new economies and these new ways of behaving. There is a way for every human being to be personally connected and develop a practice that they can find their own center, as Jim was helping us to do at the beginning of this call. There are new energy sources, not simply from nature itself, but from within the activities that we pursue in our community agency networks. And this would include the energy coming from the arts or the energy coming from new forms of value that we're creating ourselves. But then the final part of this is that we need an alternative media system, because if in fact we're only seeing these new things in our own special bubbles, but then we're going out into the world every day, into the public space, and reading the headlines that tell us that we are powerless, that the world is, is doomed really, and that there are these forces, these hard power forces that will continue to dominate our lives, and we have no choice. Then we know that we have to move out of this media sphere into a better one, where we can meet the solutions and each other. But it's not necessarily as simple as those of us who share values and those of us who are working together, maybe those of us, every one of us maybe on this call and in all the work that we're doing, we can claim that we share values, we can claim that we can see the solutions, and we can meet each other. But to some extent, I'm going to describe us, and I'm one of them, so please don't take this in a bad way, describe us as the usual suspects. We're the people that we know we already share values with. But the bigger, much bigger task will be, how do we create a media space that then invites others to share with us how they see this, how they act, what their perspective on the priorities might be? Because unless we can do that, we won't be able to have the effect globally that we're hoping for. So I've created these 3 different clouds, if you like, of audiences that we need to be able to stretch over. The first task is, how do we, as the usual suspects, build a much better communication system between us? I mean, even that doesn't exist yet. The people who do agree, who do have a shared vision, who want to really rebuild the planet and transcend the old and become transformational, those who already share this language, even we don't have a good enough communication system that we can really be sharing our tools, sharing our practices, and so on. That's task number 1. And then the second task is, how do we open that space to include people who share our values, would want the same goals, but really are traditionally find themselves shut out of this conversation. And as we move into relationship with those new audiences, how do we ourselves let go of some of our clarity and allow other people to reshape and retell the story of what is needed? And then finally, when we can build that already huge task of bringing ourselves together with the people traditionally excluded, how do we make ourselves attracted to what is probably the majority of people, those who don't talk about these problems at all, people who may not be interested in the task we've set ourselves at all? This is still the majority of people in the world. So that's the task that really I've identified, and we're going to begin looking at that today through our next couple of participants, and also I'm going to be talking with Jim in all the gaps, and please put in your own questions. But just to reiterate that this is not a simple task of us. Well, it would never be simple, right? But it's not even a clear task that we should all be trying to come together and create a new media that we all agree on. It's a complex task of being able to make a distinction between our communications with each other, extending the field of communications with each other, and then beyond that, make what it is that we're trying to give rise to attractive to people who at this point don't really care at all about what it is that we have given our attention to and what we've really committed our lives to. So I'm going to stop there and invite Jim maybe to just say a few words just on that opening salvo, and then I'll invite Pat Kane in.
Thank you, Indra. I loved what you had around the difference between war journalism and peace journalism, because we're seeing war journalism par excellence with what is going on right now in the Ukraine. And I've been increasingly concerned, actually, as the days are progressing. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is now going on for about a month. The tensions are escalating. The rhetoric is escalating. Now the president of the United States is calling Putin a war criminal. Putin is talking about the scum that needs to be eliminated in Russia, the dissenters. And you can just feel the inflammation of war beginning to seep in on both sides, and an increasingly dangerous situation. So my question is to you, in the middle of the Ukraine invasion, with everything that's in play, how, if you were wanting to do something along the lines of your new communication and media within the current situation, what would you bring in to what's happening right now, and how would you do it in a way that could break through the war journalism into some kind of peace journalism? What would that look like for you within the context of what's happening in Ukraine right now?
I mean, it's a number of fronts, Jim. And perhaps if I was just to take it back to the question of war journalism and peace journalism, to be able to always report on what is going on with the alternatives that are available. So we find that it's very rare for the news coverage to talk about the peace options that are on the table, or to give attention to the peace talks that are going on. It's only ever focused on whether or not Zelensky himself is talking to Putin, or whether a world leader is. But the bigger possibilities of the peace activities that are going on, or the communications activities that are going on between Russians and Ukrainians, for example, or that can really emphasize the connectedness of the people across the region, or to be, drawing attention to the desire of those people in both Ukraine and in Russia to not be in a war situation. This is something, the call, if you like, the call for peace. And then if that was in a way the mainstream discussion, to be showing the possibilities and how war could come to an end quickly, to always be balancing that out with coverage of how we are moving towards a world without war, what that actually means, how it invites us to challenge the war instinct in ourselves, in our communities. When we find ourselves suddenly, demonizing the other, or making it a clear situation of we're the goodies, they're the baddies, to challenge that in ourselves, because that simply is never the case. There's a history and a context and a global cultural, structural reality that is propping up this war all the time. Part of that is, of course, the military-industrial complex, but also it's the multiple interests, economic interests. Why is Ukraine being fought over in the way it is? And to be always trying to draw that back into a bigger picture of what is possible. What we're saying about the soft power, hard power, is that the demand for quite a different world doesn't really find its way into the media headlines. We're always being drawn back into this idea that it's all about us against the other. And that does not prepare us for change. So ultimately, both business and politics responds to the stronger evidence of what it is that people want, because in the end, they want our votes and they want our business. So being able to curate that, create space for that, make that really known, what a human civilization really wants as its future, should be sitting alongside this conflict. It shouldn't, the conflict itself shouldn't be the only thing that is on the front pages, because we're capable of more than that now. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that says enough.
Yeah, thank you so much. And this brings us to Stan Pokras put in the chat this book by Clay Shirky, Here Comes Everybody, The Power of Organizing Without Organizations. And I think that's essentially what you're saying. And that's really the essence of Joe Nye's soft power dynamic, that people are being empowered everywhere at all kinds of levels. And it's the coming of everybody into the war journalism that creates the space for peace journalism. I mean, if you think about it. Because we do have the vested interests that are wanting us to march toward war, the military-industrial complex and all its nefarious dimensions. So the real question is, how do we, knowing that everybody is in some way empowered right now, how do we bring them into organizing without organizations in a way that creates the space in the public domain for alternatives such as you're describing? Is that a fair kind of assessment of what you're saying?
Yeah, to some extent it is. Although I would say, and I'm saying this to myself now, and I'm going to invite Pat Kane in. Pat, if you want to, share your video, come into the space. Hello. It does start with the individual, right? So the individual really does have to find it in themselves to make the shift first, right? That's my number one thing, right? This is the I, we world aspect. Because if we find in ourselves that at this moment, we ourselves just want to beat the other, if that's the mindset that we find ourselves in, just want to, just demonize the enemy and make sure that that is destroyed, then it's very hard for us to give way to something else that now needs to occur. And then the second thing I would say is that it's not entirely without form what we're suggesting. What we're suggesting is that when people come together in their community agency networks, that it is good actually to take form. Because when they begin to take form, then they become real incubators of change. While they're formless, it's very hard to get traction and to find that you can make new decisions at a community level, for example, in the face of the climate crisis. But when they take form, it's possible to create governance, new forms of governance amongst people, and make decisions like we're going to become less dependent on oil now. We're going to really up our solar power in our own city or whatever, and we're going to do that as networks across a state, for example. It needs form to have traction. So yes, sort of yes and no, but again, starting with the self. It's really being open to the fact, the idea that there might be solutions, I think becomes very, very important.
And just as a quick note, before we go to Pat, when everybody comes in, you also have this extraordinary phenomenon of the accidental hero. The young girl that took the video of the 9 minutes of George Floyd's death. Didn't see herself as even everybody or as an activist in any kind of way, but had the technology, readily available and recorded. And it was because it was recorded that history was changed.
Yeah.
So you multiply the kind of the random elements in the system when everybody is potentially empowered through the technology of communication and media.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just thank you, Jim. Yeah, absolutely. So I'd like to hand over to Pat Kane now. And Pat is the co-initiator of the Alternative Global, but also Pat's history is that he's been a journalist for many decades. He was also one of the founding editors of the Sunday Herald in Scotland. He's been a lifelong musician, and he's the author of a book called The Play Ethic. So Pat's been very active in all of these fields. And Pat, you're going to share with us some of the thinking around over the 5 years that we've done with the alternative that's leading to a proposition or a proposal for a new kind of media. So over to you.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm such a traditional journalist that I'm always incredibly tentative about switching on to my share screen, but I'm going to do it effectively, and let's see if it works for all of you. I hope you can all see that. Indra, you'll be telling me whether things I can be heard or whether things can be seen.
I can see it.
Onto slideshow.
Yeah.
All right. And then also, Indra, tell me whether when I run a video, tell me whether you can hear it, because I'm not sure whether it'll be, but it's possible.
It's all good.
Hi everyone. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Pat Kane, co-initiator Alternative Global. I was tasked by Indra, my co-initiator, to write a white paper in that classic tech sense, where you write a white paper that is the kind of the theory of change or the evidence base for your project. So I was tasked by Indra to sort of try and write a white paper for growing an alternative media system. And that's, I can happily distribute that paper to people who want to read it and digest it. It's full of footnotes. But this is a kind of skimming across the top. But just in terms of connecting back to a few things of what people have said, certainly, Jim, a classic example of the accidental hero with a smartphone recording a reality that the mainstream doesn't see. That's coming up in a few seconds. But also, just all the way, this particular presentation is premised on climate crisis and climate urgency. So in a sense, as you're watching it through, you'll be familiar with many of the arguments, but I think the question about what a climate journalism is as opposed to a modern industrial journalism is almost as equally interesting a distinction, or a planetary journalism as opposed to a national journalism. So I think that distinction might be quite useful as we go forward. But what do we build to address these distinctions? What new forms of media system, practice, initiatives might answer and address some of these problems? So that's the kind of context for what I'm doing. our media system is broken. We talked about politics being broken in the alternative global, but the media, one of the consequences of that is the implications of that is that the media system is broken. And I'm just going to show you this clip. Hopefully it appears, hopefully you can hear it, but I'll set it up in context. This was an incident that happened in Glasgow about 4 or 5 months ago, where two people who were being pulled out by the punitive asylum system out of their houses, out of their tenement houses in Glasgow, were stopped by a collective action, a spontaneous collective action from across the city. But I'm going to show you a report of it from a major news provider and a report of it from someone's window with a smartphone, and just see over the next 2 minutes if you can tell the difference.
We can't hear any sound here.
Okay.
Pat, when you shared, did you click the sound button down at the lower left corner on the share?
Okay. Okay. No, I didn't.
Okay, stop your share and then come back again and you can get it to start.
Okay. 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 Okay, back again. And then what do I do? Oh yes, share sound. There we go. Got it. Okay. Always forget to do that. I told you I was an old school journalist. Here we go. Okay. We'll try that again. Hold on a second. Okay, let's try that again.
You're not full screen yet, Pat.
Okay.
An immigration enforcement An immigration enforcement van containing 2 men was surrounded today by protesters attempting to prevent it from leaving a street in Glasgow. Some of the protesters were heard shouting, "Let our neighbours go." Police Scotland said a number of its officers had been called to the south side of the city to support the UK border agency. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon described the situation as deeply concerning. Tonight, the 2 men have been released.
Okay, so I guess the point is obvious there between the mainstream media report, which manages to capture a few straggly protesters sitting on the ground, surrounded by kind of police, and what someone filmed hanging out of the window, an accidental hero with a smartphone, showing the full phenomenon of the incident. So there's someone actually on the fly, and with me editing these 2 clips together. That's an alternative media system at a very basic, clay shirty, small elements coming together level. So that's a small example of it. So, so what is the problem with the broken system? What are the problems that they present? That's a page with the top-selling newspaper in the UK, the Daily Mail, tabloid, middle-brow tabloid, doing its job on pushing forward a perception of asylums, of migrants and asylum seekers as problematic, troublesome, draining of resources, potentially causing social chaos and disruption. So that's the mainstream media. I think it's somewhat the same in the US, but certainly in the UK, the national papers and the national media, particularly in its commercially secured forms, play on collective fears and increase social polarisation. And the numbers, the percentages measuring trust in media are dropping precipitately, 40% in January 2019, 28% according to a poll in January 2021, 28%, from 40% to 28%. You can see where that curve is going in terms of trust in the mainstream media. But another problem is, never mind the national media and their relationship with establishments, at the local level, most communities don't see themselves or their local world in relation to the global world in their daily news media. 2/3 of local authority districts, which are kind of counties or regions in the UK, 2/3 of the local authority districts lack a daily newspaper. There's no daily newspaper coming in online or offline to these areas, reflecting back what's happening, what the distributions of power are, where they are, who's the active forces, what's the actual, just the feel and the culture of the area. None of that coming back as local media. And then the other problem might be is, well, what's the alternative response? It's very small by comparison with what's out there. I did a survey of the existing sort of alt media, progressive, non-corporate media outlets in the UK, and I did a bit of an analysis of it 6 months ago. That their total monthly UK visits were 7.259 million. The total UK visits of Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok are 114,120,000. So if we want to put our faith in the existing and the alt media to kind of be a counterbalance to the mainstream media, to shift perceptions, to change the way that things are perceived, not doing very well at all in the current formulation, which is mostly blogs and websites with what I call, and what actually not what I call, but it's actually designed as addictive media. So who needs and wants an AMS? Well, I think one of the things we wanted to do with this presentation, and very much again in the spirit of what's a peace journalism as opposed to a war journalism, is that what would a planet journalism be as opposed to, say, a complacent, environmentally complacent journalism. And so the next few slides are going to focus on the way that people think about how they should react to news about the climate crisis and about the urgencies of that. What's the role of ethical and sustainable consumption values in British life? And one of the things that this report is based on, it comes from Deloitte, is what Kantar called the value action gap. What's the value action gap? 92% of people in the UK say they want to live a sustainable green life, but only 16% are actively changing their behaviours. So there's an obvious intervention point for an alternative media system, and maybe a media system involving a number of elements, not just either news or advertising. So this is quite an interesting few sets of slides asking questions about what people are committed to doing, and it's just these really tell you where people actually are on their set of attitudes about responding to climate change. A lot of it is to do with quite practical stuff like waste reduction, sustainable packaging and circular practices, very, very high up on the levels as opposed to, say, reducing carbon footprint or conserving water and other natural resources. People are really concerned with better schemes to remove plastics and packaging. That's 64%, 50% clarity on how to recycle old products. Things that you've done in the last 6 months, 61% saying limited my use of single-use plastic, bought more seasonal produce. The point I think I'm making here is that there's a value action gap, where people, if they do act, they act in a way that's very consumerist. That they act in a way that's close to how they behave, and so the intervention point for media is how do you get at that sense that the most available and credible actions in people's heads are going to be the ones that they take as consumers, maybe even as in the old Alvin Toffler sense, prosumers, but it's something that they're going to immediately do in the midst of their own lifestyles. Greenpeace, one of the things that I think we're going to talk about in a wee minute is the question of what is the stimulus that causes a planet-friendly action? Is it cognitive first, or is it emotional first, or do you find some kind of blend whereby you're moved to act, and then you reach for the facts that answer that emotion, and then that causes a concrete action? There's a kind of set of loops there that we're interested in exploring within the media system. But check this out as a visceral attempt to get at the value action gap, to get at the cognitive emotional gap. This is a video from Greenpeace featuring our famous Prime Minister.
There is no greater duty for any nation than protecting our people and our planet. The UK government is a global leader in tackling plastic pollution, and we can be incredibly proud of what we are doing. Plastic everywhere, out now. What in the wibbling fiddlesticks? Well, thank you, crisps. We have banned plastic straws, plastic stirrers, and plastic cotton buds to make sure that we turn the tide. It is time for the world to truly wake up to the damage being done to the environment and the sheer volume of plastic that is dumped. Let us secure the very health of the planet for our children, grandchildren, and generations to come.
So that's partly an example of us also curating best practice. So that's the kind of stuff that's already being made, but that's obviously looking at is looking at a set of statistics that have been gathered through polls, and they're saying, how do we intervene? How do we intervene emotionally at the right point, and then bring in the facts and then guide people to action? So that in a sense, that's a sort of best practice of what NGOs are doing to intervene in the existing system, by using the internet rather than thinking they were going to make that as a mainstream advert. But it's quite data driven and quite targeted, and we think it's quite a good bit of practice. But if it's our stuff, the immediate practical life of our consumer stuff, which is where most people will be susceptible to starting the great transition, if that's what we want them to do, then there are big questions here. One would be, being militant against the government doesn't have much agency in 4 yearly parliamentary democracies. So the question is, how can you act now? And that's an interesting question for an alternative media system to answer. How do you act now rather than waiting for the next electoral cycle? And then the second point is that the actual science of ecology at the moment says that northern nations need to be post-stuff, need to have drastically addressed their consumer existences by 2030 ideally, but certainly not much later than that. And purely in terms of the climate exigency, I'm sure you've seen this graph. The one in the middle is probably the most, it could be terrifying, but it could be exciting. That's the craziest roller coaster ride you've ever seen in terms of getting CO2 emissions to decline from 2020 to 2040 or 2055 to zero. It looks like a crazy, vertiginous ride. How will it be done? Say many experts, and this is taken from Jason Hickel's work and Grubler's work, it will be done by reducing excess material throughput. So in a sense, there's the horizon. That's definitely a horizon of reality within which an alternative media system could operate. So it's possible that if we use 80% less energy and resources within the time frame, we can do that. How do we do that? By organizing the economy around human needs rather than around capital accumulation. how do we get there? And that is an interesting list there, which I think all of them have a bearing on how our media depicts reality. I mean, it's almost like a kind of an agenda you could program in the same way as the Financial Times programs in its agenda for how an effective capitalism happens. You know, you introduce binding targets to reduce materiality. You scale down the problem industries. You shift from private cars to public transportation. Imagine a news agenda that took that seriously. They shift from private cars to public transportation. You limit advertising. You ban planned obsolescence. What does a consumer culture mean if we actually make products that can be repaired and used rather than just tossed away? Shorten the working week, public job guarantee, basic income. Replace GDP with more holistic measures of progress. This is a massive change, but it's not unthinkable, and it would be thinkable if we had a differently calibrated and maybe a differently designed media system. So, how would we get there? What if an alternative media system was working from these kind of assumptions that I think some of the more credible climate science claims are important, then what elements would we need in that system for it to be both viable as a news system, but also attractive to the people who need to hear the message? And I'll take you back to Indra's 3-cloud image, not just the usual suspects, not just those who are not involved with this, but share our values, but also those around the 2 inner clouds who really are not connected at all and need to be connected to. What, ideally and optimally, what things do we need to design and make to make that possibility both viable and attractive? One of the solutions to this is to, and as a sort of basic rule of thumb, as a methodology for journalistic practice, would be to do solutions journalism. There is such a thing as solutions journalism or constructive journalism. And these are lines from the white paper that says that recent social psychology research, and I have the links at the bottom there if anybody wants to use them afterwards, I'm happy to share. Recent social psychology shows how solutions journalism increases the likelihood of a reader's active and civically oriented responses to its content. It's been shown and measured quite carefully to make you a more active, civically active reader. And this is as opposed to the passivity induced by the norm of existing news media, which is catastrophizing, polarizing, problems-centered. It's very interesting to compare that to the previous analysis of war journalism that Andrew was making. And I just threw this slide in from another presentation, which is the question of, well, how do you establish, where does emotion come into this picture? You know, how carefully should you be handling it? A lot of what is said in places like Reddit and social media circles is that feels determines reals. You know, the emotion is what captures you, and then you seek the facts to back up that emotion. That's a powerful mechanism, but it's also a potentially manipulative and directive mechanism. So, but it's being used by those who, by populists, by advertisers, by corporates to change behavior. We would like to start a conversation about how one could have a different relationship to emotion and cognition, leading to a better media, because there's no doubt that process is being used. How do we use it in a more progressive, humane way? Perhaps, if you remember back to Indra's presentation, the range of emotions that she showed from her paradigm, which is drawn from human-given psychology, there's at least 9 there. That's not just fear and anger and loathing and panic. How do we begin to construct kinds of media that might look at the emotional backgrounding for the kind of facts that we're looking for, and handle that in a non-manipulative way, in an interesting way? Here's a diagram that one of our colleagues suggested about how this might work. Calls it the feel, think, do funnel. And there's just elements there that maybe are interesting to think about. You would need a reactive social media that was constantly looking for trends and memes that were arising, but you would intervene with those memes and debates and disputes with material from the daily alternative platform or another form of platform that was amassing material in a coherent way, and you might push that on to other bits of the system that you built. Let me go, maybe flip forward and talk about some of the things that were mentioned there. And this is, we're kind of riffing on the idea, the basic idea that we already have quite a powerful and persuasive media landscape on the corporate side. What would our versions of these services be? So the first there that we're talking about is an Earthflix. We're trying to do that with the Daily Alternative, and that's a content news platform. Imagine you had a social media platform that wasn't a Facebook, but a Wellbook. You know, how would the algorithms and captology work on a Wellbook as opposed to a Facebook? What if you were thinking about a constellation of enterprises and makers, solutionists, initiatives who would both feed into this media system with stories, but would also support it in quite a practical way, because it would be at least circulating a different agenda about reality than existing or dominant ones. And then the fourth point is, to what extent do we find ways to fund this? Subscription is a great discussion to have. Things like Patreon and Substack and other crowdsourcing and subscription-based platforms are showing that you can find an audience that is willing to pay a certain amount of money in the pie chart of their media spend to your project rather than just to the traditional project. I'll go through this quite quickly. This is in the sense, what kind of content would you make? If you were doing a makeover housing program, how would that provide opportunity for you to think about planning? If you were doing gardening shows, how would that help you think about permaculture, so forth? That's the Daily Alternative that I've been editing for the last 5 years. We have thousands of posts, well taxonomized, which full of categories that we can just send to people and give them 50 to 100 articles on the things that they need. A Wellbook, there are people like cloudron.io who are literally offering you a range of social media functionalities that would feed back to your database rather than to a corporate or external database. That's exciting to explore. And again, there are existing things like Signal and Telegram and Clubhouse show that there's movement in this area, but how could we get it together to build our own app platform that services a planet-friendly or a planet-concerned agenda? That's just a vision of the kind of organizations that have been circulating around the Alternative Global. We hope to these are the kind of people who we would both test the system against and ask to contribute into it, and also suggest that they would find it useful to be able to be in this world, but also take messages from this world and project it outwards. And that's just questions about sort of funding. So that's a bit of a breakneck run through what an alternative media system might require in terms of the background case for it, the stats that justify it, and the new structures that we might have to look for help from others, from hackers, from coding and creative communities to build. And as I say, it's a beginning, but at least it's the start. And with that, I'll stop the share.
That's fantastic. Thanks very much, Pat. And an evidence of how long we've been thinking about it with other news organizations and contemplating the real task, if you like, that is no simple task, but at the same time has so many solutions as well, so many possibilities that really to invite people into that possibility is really the point of a session like this today. And before we go back into a broader conversation, I think we should at this point bring Sushna Joseph into our conversation, who will really open up again a whole nother level of really what I would be calling the attraction towards these solutions. And Sushma is already 15 years in advertising and broadcast media in India. She's helped to launch the biggest global brands like Google and Skoda, Game of Thrones, MasterChef Australia. She's done all of that work. And was part of the biggest talk show in India, in fact, Coffee with Karen, which won local and international creative awards, and year after year, winning awards as a producer and a director, and was creative director of, is that right, at MTV, O&M, BBH, Star World? You've had quite a career already, Sushna. And now trying to harness learnings from both the advertising and media industries to bring about a creative revolution to help build a better world by creating what she describes as entertainment with purpose. So Sushma, I'd like to just hand over to you for the next 10 minutes or so and just share with us something of your vision from where you are, you know, from a different part of the world than we're operating from. We'd like to hear about it in your voice, but also to use some of the tools that we have in common, actually. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I always find it very difficult to write bios. I always feel that I miss out a large part of me, which is, for a large part of my life I was a singer. It's completely different. But then, you know, it's what I've mainly tried to do through my life was try to do things differently, because I always did that. Just to give everyone a bit of background, I grew up in a small town in India, in southern India, but my family and my parents were very progressive, so they gave me all the freedom to do what I wanted. So which is why, although I come from a family of academics, I went into the creative industry, and just because I thought it would be fun, mainly, but it made me curious about the industries, about advertising and about entertainment. And after working at I followed big names, and after realizing that's not filling the hole in my soul somehow, I took a break after 15 years, and for the past 2 years, well timed with the pandemic at least, I've been thinking about what to do next and the opportunities that come with crisis. And I've gone back to the first principles of both these industries that I was a big part of, and one of them is entertainment. The word itself means to bring people together as you know, to enjoy something at the same time, and that was, I was like, okay, that's the industry I'm part of. But the opposite is what's happening. Like Pat very eloquently put, media is broken, and it gives us an opportunity to check what happened and why are we here. And I think with these conversations, we are able to say that emperor has no clothes. Like there are lots of things that we can change about this. And what struck me as strange was that this is part of the creative industry. Why isn't there creative solutions to where we are headed? And so I started going back to advertising principles. I think that's quite honestly, I think that's an industry which is really misunderstood, because the moment you say advertising, a lot of people think of it being lies, but that's bad advertising. Good advertising tells you the truth in a creative way. It helps people who have the need to find the product that's solving that need. It's not about disguising lies as truth and selling it in a creative way. That, I think that's bad at advertising, and I've had these conversations with people over the years. Which is why I think the NHS example that Pat shared, or maybe it was you, I think that's bad advertising because it was lying. Although all of these platforms work, you know, radio still works, TV still works, advertising still works. The thing I've seen over the years, the good work which was celebrated were work which were effective, which changed behaviors, which made it solved business problems. It made people go and buy that product and be happy about it. You know, it's got a noble, it is a noble profession, which was my existential crisis as I was working in that industry. I was like, am I part of people who lie? Like, is that my contribution to society? So these are very deep conversations I've had with myself, and I was like, no, we're doing it wrong, and that's why I want to that sparked the idea of, wait, if media on the whole and advertising is so powerful, it's really powerful. I mean, the biggest the politicians use it to push their propaganda everywhere, right? And there's because it's powerful, and there's businesses come to advertising agencies to find creative solutions to how to create solve their business problems. So it's very effective. It's very effective because creativity is also a part of us, and that's something that I want to shake up, at least, which is the whole idea of the creative revolution that I think is something that I want to be part of. Is at BBH, this agency I worked at, there was one of the principles that was there on the mirror that I read every day as I walked into the office was creativity can come from anyone and anywhere. It was not an agency that said, like, okay, you know, like only the copywriter is going to write the idea. It was like we all have creativity as part of us, and that again, I felt like an outsider in a advertising agency because I had science background, but that kind of made me feel welcome, you know, that I could do creative writing too, and that's what I realized in the last 2 years, that we are stuck in boxes. Like, I have so many of my doctor, engineer, scientist friends who don't explore their creative side, and I think that's us not embracing our entire selves. And I feel like once we do, we'll come alive, and that's how we'll come alive in the world. I think creativity helps us heal. Art is defiant, and us as an industry can mobilize this to bring about this change, to save ourselves. Even the reason why we're here, like, they say the way humanity can kill itself is by nuclear, by AI, which is tech, by war, or a pandemic. And we've seen how media has made these crises worse through our lived collective experience. Right now, a lot of these things are ongoing, and which is why I think the antidote is for us to all it's coming together and talking about how the emperor has no clothes, and us completely embracing our true authentic selves while communicating with each other, while bringing these forces together. And I don't know, I think there's something there that I want to explore and have further conversations with, because I think a lot of these industries are somehow still working in silos, and we're not talking to each other. I think there are lots of voices that through this pandemic, at least we've seen, at least the people I've spoken to, everyone has a crazy personal story that we just went through. And I think those stories from here in India can translate very well to a redneck Texan in the US or somewhere else. Those personal stories have to be communicated. And I think as communication platforms as industries that we need to help facilitate that. So that's basically where I'm at. I'm trying to with some partners trying to build this new age media system and the way of working, which is going to be, which I'm very aware needs to be different, because in the big media companies that I've worked at, the focus in the end was always on how to make it bigger next time. And you don't have to, sometimes you don't have to make it bigger, or increase revenue was the North Star. And my challenge is that if we know for a fact, as we've measured in advertising, on the effectiveness being on ground action, on changed behavior, why can't that be the key measurements that we use in creating content, in building entertainment in an entertaining way, like, which is something that we all need. Even in the pandemic, we saw that we didn't need too much, but we needed entertainment, and we all have stories to tell. I think there's a need to tell the stories, and there's a need to consume all of these different stories and feel the oneness that we do feel through the hard times, which we're all feeling. And that this was reiterated through a documentary that I came across by Gabor Mate on the wisdom of trauma, where he talks about that each of us have childhood traumas, and that the trauma is not the event, but our inability to talk about that event. We feel the trauma because we feel alone, but that can be alleviated only by finding more people, by realizing that we're not alone, and just saying it out there. So I think there's several ways how this can help people, and art can be, or any sort of creative expression can be a way for us to heal together, individually and therefore collectively. Because if we want to change the world, we all will have to change ourselves. I don't think there's a shortcut to that. So yeah, and then I think in that way, peace journalism, which you guys touched upon, was coming together of everyone. Like there's a mind shift change that can be affected, where we're going upstream of the problem of, there's so many issues, but I think we're solving the symptoms and not the disease. If we go upstream of the problem and see that we all need to live seriously, we all need love, and we need that from each other, and we need that because we're not being seen and we're not being heard. So media can bring out these stories and share it in whichever way that it can be social media, it can be mainstream media like TV. They all still exist. You'll keep hearing video kill the radio star from the 80s. Radio's still around. It's just more platforms gets added on. The platforms increases. I think our scarcity mindset that we are kind of stuck in, which says that if something new has come, we feel attacked or we feel threatened. It doesn't have to be you. You can all celebrate it together. That's a shift that we can achieve, I think, through content, and it's a fun way to do it also. So I'm very hopeful with what lies ahead of us, the challenge, but it's also accept the reality, but also I think it gives us opportunity to make a change in any way we can imagine. Sorry,
now,
I can't hear you.
Now I'm muted at least once every event. Yeah, no, thank you so much, Sushma. And what I could sense very much from what you're describing is, in a sense, the interconnectedness, if you like, of what's happening to us on a personal level and our needs and everything that you're describing, but at the same time, the need to be congregating with others and to be able to share those feelings in quite a real way, on the ground, actually, in the places where we live. And this becomes a source of a new kind of intelligence. And that could be driving this new media system. So I think what's different about what you're bringing to the surface here, and we're definitely championing as well at The Alternative, and others do, is that it isn't simply about how the whole of the internet, can provide solutions, but somehow it has to be able to self-organize, and give people somewhere to take action through having all of this information. So it's like we're in another age now. We're already in the third age, if you like, or the third decade of this revolution, where we started by simply waking up to all this stuff that we didn't know. And then what you're really showing is how the individual person's needs came right into the center of the picture. Despite being in this global space, it didn't move away from our needs, actually. And then how do we organize those needs to get met, right? So this is where we talk about the community agency networks and how all of that drives this new media. So the media is not simply coming from out there to us. We are also feeding our intelligence into it all the time. So, and advertising can really carry that. Pat, I think you've got a question for Sushma.
Yes, Sushma, hi, really loved what you were saying. It's interesting, the Greenpeace video that I showed was commissioned by a guy who's trying to set up a new kind of advertising agency, but at the time the video was made, he was the communications officer for Greenpeace. And he was telling me, a guy called James Turner, he was telling me that every day, every week, he would have very, very creative people from the advertising industry and the marketing industry beating a path to his door saying, can I do this for you? Your cause is incredible. Please use me, and use me at price or at cost, or use me for free, but just use me. So you were talking about what's a different measurement for success in that industry. Is it increased sales, or is it kind of a change in behavior, or a change of perspective? But I'm wondering whether there's I'm wondering this is what you're doing, which is to set up a structure that's somewhere between, hard-nosed, bottom line, money-making, advertising, marketing, and on the other side, starved charity trying to stop terrible things happening in the world. Is there something in between that, that somehow finds a way to make itself sustainable economically, but which is actually organized in such a way that says, we're going to use our fantastic storytelling, imaging, symbolizing, mediating skills to get people down that slide. In my presentation, the steep slide between now and 2035, 2045, because that's a crazy ride, right? And so how do people go that fast to a necessary destination? And I think you said it, feel good about it. Surely that is an amazing challenge. But do we need a new kind of company or a new kind of structure that would make that happen between these two poles?
Yeah, I think, I reframed that question, and I said, what is my question, or what am I trying to solve, where I'm the answer of say creating great ads, and what you said greatly resonated with me, because every single creative friend of mine across the years who I met, who I've told this idea to, has been like, just send me the brief. I'm in however much time I need to put on this, because all of us felt like, because creative people, a lot of them artists who feel like they've sold out, right? Like you're eventually using your creative capabilities to sell hair oil or a car. And it really bothered us. And so, which is why your friend's getting all these inquiries. And that is exactly what I think I'm trying to solve, is to say that if I say I'm going to use your creativity and help people, this group of people are excited, this group of people are excited, and there are a lot of people who want to back these kind of ideas. There are a lot of donors who've come ahead and said, if that's what's going to be your measurement, go ahead and do it. And right now I'm just stalled because I'm just scared by the potential of this idea, because I'm like, it is bankable. It's very bankable. If you're going to gather the best creative minds in advertising, and I'm saying, like, I'm going to make this a global concerted effort, and we're going to change people's life, how it's going to affect policies or governance or your lives that you're living every day. People want to back it. It is economically viable, but that's not going to be the measurement. I always felt like, good, if you're having fun and if you're doing great work, money will follow, and that's how I think we need to behave as well, because being only capitalism minded is rewarding bad behaviors.
Thank you, Greg.
I'd like to invite Jim back in. Jim, if you would like to come and join us again, and just invite any thoughts that you have, because you've been really working at the same coalface as we have, and wonder if this resonates with you. Especially where all the way that, in fact, that Pat described the possibility, the problem, and the possibility, and now how Sushma has added other dimensions to it. I wonder how that reflects on how you've been thinking about this. Big question. I'm sorry.
First of all, Pat and Sushma, Indra, thank you so much. I've been fascinated listening to you all. And you know what I was struck by in your comments, Sushma, was just how complex this whole domain of communication, marketing, media, consumer sales, profit really is. And it's not so easy to navigate between revenue and saving the world. And many attempts have foundered trying to do both simultaneously. And when you throw in COVID and you throw in, the invasion of Ukraine, the mind gets overwhelmed by the complexities in a very deep way. So I just want to acknowledge what you brought into the conversation. And Pat, the one thing that you brought in that I'd like us to discuss, and I'm thinking, Indra, of your slide on, us usual, what did you say? The usual
suspects.
Then you've got the people who agree with us but are disempowered in some way. And then you have the people who kind of disagree. Well, I think Pat is bringing in a fourth category that is really worth considering out of your statistic, Pat, that, like, on climate change, 92% of the people, that's 9 out of 10, agree that something should be done and they need to live sustainably. And yet only 16% actually get it together to do the obvious. And this is something that's come up a number of times on Humanity Rising. And one of the speakers several months ago referred to them as the great asleep. They know what they need to do, but somehow the lethargy of sleepwalking through life is stronger than the willingness to change even the smallest amount. There's similar statistics about exercise. Everybody knows they need to exercise, And yet the fraction of people that actually do, and you've got that 80-20 rule that seems to show up in so many parts of life. So part of, I think our challenge, and I'd love to, hear your comments, our challenge is how do the usual suspects who are actually doing something about it reach out to the usual suspects who aren't? That feels to me to be in some ways a $64,000 question in terms of outreach and media motivation.
Can I? I'm sure.
Yeah,
Andrew has
please.
lots to say about this in terms of citizen action networks and community action networks and CANs. But between the gap between value and action is filled with structure and practice. So for example, if you are, and each one of those statistics which talked about, most of them at the very top talked about plastic waste and their disgust with the amount of single-use plastic that was in their lives. It's when you walk into any high street, it's incredibly structurally difficult. You might go in with an intent for good practice, but it's structurally very, very difficult to follow on your path. Some people are provisioning it, some not. So there's an interesting question there about our suburbs and our cities and our centres of towns. Most local councils, I don't know what it's like in the US, but in the UK, most of them will sell off to some big box retailer because they think that's a way to bring money in to pay off their debts, rather than sitting down with the community or feeling pressure from the community, which is where we're at. How do you build the pressure from the community? It says, well, we really need to fundamentally redesign this and design this for different practice. But the compulsion to do that has to come from a purer place. The kind of the ways that we think about, or Indra has been thinking about in the alternative, about how you form someone's will through conviviality and through futuring and through different kinds of debate, which suddenly says, yes, we want to live this lifestyle, this kind of lifestyle, but it has the energy we think has to build up from below, but it has to be about structure and practice has to be involved in it. And then I think transition towns, which I'm sure you're all aware of, has had a good run at showing how this could happen. You think, you reconceive what a pub is, you reconceive what local urban farming is, you reconceive what communications are, you reconceive what local transport is, but you do it by joyful small initiatives. We're very sympathetic with that. But how do you accelerate that process and strengthen that process? Maybe using some of the tech, whether it's the blockchain tech or the communication tech or the energy tech, that is maybe more available to communities to empower them in this direction than has existed before. So I think there's structure and practice in the gap between value and action, I think.
And the thing that I'd add to that, and I think that's really well put, Pat, is that architecture, that structure, that practice is actually arising. It's really emerging every day. It's amazing how many initiatives there are out there. But unless there is a mechanism for bringing them into relationship with each other, right? If that is not happening, that's the comms system that we're describing. So we need a better communication system between all the usual suspects that help people to accelerate the building of the architecture. So we can borrow from somewhere in Mexico or somewhere in Africa or somewhere in India. A lot we're borrowing from India, so that we can actually share these tools with each other and accelerate the architecture of change. As Pat says, that's what's missing. We think we're just surrounded by millions of possibilities. Somebody asks you to stop flying airplanes and stop eating meat, and you don't even know how to go about that because in your supermarket there isn't any option there, right? So that's why you need the cans. You need incubators of change happening in every locality. Without these incubators, they don't exist. But I just want to bring in also what Sushma was referring to, because those emotional needs that we have, that traditionally advertisers were getting met, right? So the need for status, the need for belonging, you know, I'm gonna buy a can of Coke and suddenly I'm part of a peace movement, apparently, right? It's knowing how to call that out and say, but not demonize the emotion. That's the thing that's hard to achieve, because you hear people saying, for example, oh, that person's only seeking status, or that person just wants, you know, to make a mark on the wall or whatever. Those things are very legitimate. It's just when you do them in the wrong way for cheap gain, you end up destroying something. But if you can be offered ways to get those needs met in ways that help the whole planet, then you're still getting your needs met. And that's, you know, the advertising industry is going to be absolutely key to that transition, in my view. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think every problem is a communication problem. I think the biggest and the smallest can be boiled down to a communication problem, which is also why I would like to know more about the peace talks that are happening during the war right now. I'm very curious, but I don't know how to access it. It's which is like you said, I think that's where as media people and as storytellers, like master storytellers, we can change that narrative. We can absolutely address, like I said, not address the symptom, but the problem, but the disease. When you were talking, Jim, I felt a bit attacked because it was like, I know I'm a procrastinator. I know I should do a certain things in a day, but I don't get to it. It's not because I don't want to do it. It's in my list every single day, and I feel badly about the fact that it's still there and I didn't get to it. So it's a different thing that we're trying to fix. Not tell me where the car showroom is, but make me want to move and bring my legs there. You know, that's what.
Yeah, it reminds me. You know, my mother, who I loved dearly till the day she died, was a plump Sicilian. And it became a standing joke in the family that she was going to go on a diet Monday. But in the meantime, she was going to have that piece of chocolate cake because she was convinced it was one of the major food groups. And so, that we're all in the 92%. And some of us at different parts of our lives are in the 16%. So some things we do well, and then other things we're unconscious about. But let me just turn as we close, just to say something to Indra's last point about coming together. And just to say something about, and Indra knows because we're in a discussion with Humanity Rising, how do we begin to expand Humanity Rising into what we're calling Humanity Rising Interactive Network, where we start to invite other organizations that are committed to social change to start building their own programming. So you have, like we're doing 2 hours today, what if in the next session, there was the Pachamama Alliance and Amnesty International. So you start to build something like a CNN, but rather than having one voice and one editorial, you're inviting a lot of editorial perspectives by organizations and networks of organizations that are committed. For example, Pat, I thought that PSA on plastic, I'd never seen it before. I was really impacted by watching that. And I was feeling, to your point, Sushma, I don't want to use plastic, but when you go into a restaurant, they hand you a plastic straw, whether you order it or not. And then you're holding this straw that you know is contributing to this big pile. So, I mean, you know, we're beginning to think through as we approach 2 years of Humanity Rising to really strategize how we can take the next natural steps to expanding the sense of community around communication and media. And would love to include Alternative Global in this conversation, because I think that this fire in your belly around communication and media that I've been witnessing from Indra on some of our calls is the same fire that's burning in us at this moment when so much is possible, and the expense of doing it today. You don't have to build CNN. What you have to build is the opportunity for collaboration. I mean, just imagine young people coming together and have their own programming where, you know, they're taking videos and everything about what's going on in their world, and you can develop your own news channel, not by hiring journalists that you pay to go to Kiev or the Ukraine, but by just inviting young people to send, in the spirit of George Floyd, what they see happening in the world. So this is one reason why I invited Indra to do this session today, and I look forward to others, because we're exploring possibly the most potentiated domain, that if we figure it out in a way that empowers people to synergize between broadcast, education, so you get the 92%, you know, doing what they know they need to do, so that the education, broadcast, and social action become a synergistic whole from a multiplicity of perspectives and organizations around the world. You could even do it in different languages. You could do it on different, like climate change. You could do it on all kinds of different possibilities. So I just wanted to note the same motivation in today, and would love to just briefly have any comments you may want to make as we bring this to a close.
Well, I think that's what we're doing here, Jim. is building these relationships, right? And you probably saw from the people that I invited that my thought is very much to making it properly global. So inputs from different part of the world. Sorry that we didn't have Komotso with us, but would have had, because then we would have heard also different priorities probably than the ones we hold for what a news agenda might be. So I'm absolutely with you in the need for moving into collaboration between. That's the big space now. But at the same time, to have the possibility of input from the ground feeding into the system, not just organizations, but people, you know, these cans feeding into the system. So Pat, is that more or less, isn't just back to Pat, you know, who's the editor actually at the Alternative? Is that how you, do you see that?
Yes, absolutely. And I remember there was a thing that was abandoned about 10 years ago called RSS, called Really Simple Syndication. And it was abandoned because all the social media people wanted attention to go to their apps. But this was like a system that allowed people just to set up an RSS feed and feed their media and their productions in with everybody else. So I'm really, one of my jobs is as a curator, but it's quite like being an editor of things. And I think the curatorial, editorial confidence has to be regained. You were talking at the very beginning, Jim, about the exponentiality of information and connection, crying out for editors, I mean, also Sushma, for brands. So there's somewhere between the editorial function, the curatorial function, and the brand function, which we also need to think about as well, which then also deals with, is this attractive? Do I wish to be with this? And I think one of the things I always, just to conclude, is that I think so many creatives in the commercial sector or in the government sector are desperate to be kind of anarchists. They're desperate to be able to kind of make structures that are new and novel and that fit humanity. And I think we are creating the spaces in which these joyous techno-anarchists, creative techno-anarchists can rise and do stuff. So yes, please.
Yes, techno-anarchists, as Steve Jobs says, everybody should be a pirate.
I'll go with Steve.
Sushma, what do you think about all this?
I think it's fantastic. The fact that we're having this conversation is a great start. I can feel that synergy, and so far the need for the shaking up the system is there, and how do we shake up the system? Solutions are also there. Let's go do it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Indra. Any final comment that you'd like to make?
We could go on. I think my final comment is yes.
The answer is yes. And as they say, let's talk. Because I think Alternative Global is a very valuable endeavor and potential partner for what we're doing, because this is a seminal issue that we're discussing today, everyone. And I think it's a good note, Pat. Techno-anarchists. That's what we need more of out there.
Fire in the belly.
Well, thank you, all three of you, very, very much. We'll bring this session to a close. You're all welcome to the after-session chat group that Stan convenes with others. Shannon, each day you receive the link in the chat box if you can make it. We'll see you all again on Monday for a very special session on girl-driven solutions. The SDG makeover, as if women and girls actually matter and were the center of the Sustainable Development Goals. So that'll be on Monday when we reconvene.
Fantastic.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
for the space and time.
Bye, Jim. Thank you very much.
Bye now.
Bye for now.